Colleges can use affirmative action, according to the 1978 Supreme Court Bakke decision, to enhance diversity on campus, but not to compensate for historical discrimination. Almost 40 years after that court ruling, guess who's getting a leg up from affirmative action? That's right, white men. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, three white men, and this right angle comes to you thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, men, Jonathan Zimmerman, who teaches education and history at the University of Pennsylvania, tells the readers of the Washington Post recently that liberals should stop supporting the status quo of affirmative action because it actually gives white men an advantage over women and people of Asian descent. A Princeton study, for example, shows that all other things being equal, Asians need an SAT score 140 points better than a white guy to get into some elite schools. And that's because Asians are already overrepresented at those institutions. Several studies have also shown that girls have to get better grades than boys to get into top schools that are trying to maintain a balance between the sexes. Now, of course, Professor Zimmerman finds this outrageous, even though the Supreme Court said schools cannot skew admissions to compensate for historical discrimination because that would, quote, make innocent persons bear the burden of redressing grievances not of their making, end quote. Zimmerman says colleges ought to do just that. Now, when the Trump administration announced recently that it was looking into intentional race-based admissions policies and discrimination, the left pounced, assuming that the Trump administration meant to make academia white again. As it turns out, Trump was actually responding to a lawsuit by some Asians who were contesting the burden of higher requirements that they faced to get into those schools. Now, Stephen Green, what kind of dystopian country do we live in where fairness and tolerance leads to discrimination?
Oh, my. You know what we need, Scott? Do you know what this Congress needs to do and what President Trump needs to put his signature on pronto? A law against unintended consequences. That's what we need. We need to outlaw those completely, and then this whole mess and many others will just magically clear themselves up. You know what this reminds me of in a way? I just saw the numbers on this at Instapundit, and I believe college enrollments are now so skewed that it's something like 58% female to 42% male, which is way out of whack with the proportion of the population. But this makes me think back to our segments last week about the controversy about diversity at Google, where the engineer wrote that thoughtful, maybe slightly flawed, but very thoughtful and fair, I thought, memorandum about why diversity may not work for Google, and that there are cultural and sexual norms that tend to produce more male engineers, especially software engineers, than female software engineers. And so pursuing diversity or gender equality at all costs might actually harm the company. Well, when you get into universities and you've got this skew between women and men, it's not that women are so much smarter or more ambitious than men. Anything but. I'd say it's probably about 50-50. But colleges are skewing more and more female, and I think the reason is men are self-selecting themselves out of college because they're confronted with all this stuff like you've got entire departments called studies about why white men are evil and everything they ever wrote is crap. And this tends to dissuade men a little bit from wanting to pursue a degree at a university. And so now we find ourselves at a point where the affirmative action that was meant to help females and minorities now has to help men because we're self-selecting ourselves out of school because it's so slanted against us.
Now, Bill Whittle, I know for years people, especially are associated with people on the right or conservatives or Republicans, were against affirmative action mainly because it discriminated against those poor guys who were, white guys through no fault of their own, trying to get jobs. But now that we're starting to see that perhaps affirmative action policies actually may benefit white men, haven't you had a change of heart about this, Bill, and can now be supportive of these great government initiatives?
I feel like it's safe to put on my white sheets again, yes. Look, no good deed goes unpunished, right? And there are two there are two built-in injustices to affirmative action, and you mentioned the first one, and a lot of people concentrate on the first one, that white students who have the merit to get in are excluded because of this top-down policy. But the real damage that affirmative action done is to minority students, to black students. It does them damage coming in, and it does them damage going out. If you basically say that, we'll just pick a number. If a white kid needs a 1200 to get into a school, but a black kid can get in with a 950, in order to redress this historical imbalance, then what you're telling that student right off the bat is you're not as good as the rest. And the outgoing damage it does is you could be a black student who got 1600 on your SATs and go completely through the thing first in your class the whole way out, and there will always be this taint of, well, is this an affirmative action kind of a guy? It taints you and harms you on the way out. This is what happens when you come up with these kind of things. Now, there is, in fact, certainly in the 60s and 70s when this stuff was being proposed, it's interesting to me because there were two programs and they worked in concert. But on some level, I think one affirmative action is tremendously damaging. I thought the other was terrific, which is the United Negro College Fund. Now that is something that you could absolutely get behind, because what that was doing was saying that black people are economically disadvantaged in this country because of the history of slavery, and we're going to try and redress the access issue so that we can, basically it's a scholarship fund for black students who were able to make the grade. Now, the United Negro College Fund is exactly the kind of thing that I think is the kind of a remedy that society should use. It's voluntary. It's non-discriminatory to the degree that it's not saying you're not as good as somebody else. It is saying, well, maybe you have economic disadvantages, but we'll help you up with that. And it's a pity that we went so far to the coercive end and so far away from what was and remains a really, really sound and beautiful idea. And we've made a lot of those decisions lately.
Hey, Bill, you just reminded me of something. I grew up as a kid in St. Louis. I would see commercials on all the time for the United Negro College Fund. And I hadn't
Mind is a terrible thing to waste.
Or from them in maybe 15 years or longer. Are they still around even?
I don't know, but I do know they were based on merit, so they had to be destroyed. That was no. See, but this is the thing, right?
Yeah.
This is the thing. You could make the case on a macro scale that affirmative action is selecting against merit for underprivileged people, while the United Negro College Fund was selecting for merit. It was going to send the best and brightest to colleges where they wouldn't have to accept a lower score to get in, and where they could clean the clocks on a lot of these white and Asian kids' scores. That's why it was such a great idea. And this comes back to the difference between W.E.B. Du Bois's policy versus that of Booker T. Washington's, which is an entire history lesson in itself.
Yeah. And speaking of historical context, for those among our younger viewers, when Bill Whittle suggested that somebody might get a top score of 1600, that was because Bill went to school at a time when there were only 2 sections on the SAT, and 1600 was the top score.
How many are there
now?
Is
that not true anymore?
I believe it's 3 sections now, and I believe the top score is something like 2100 or something like that. No.
3 sections, no, top score's 1200. Yeah.
There's a whole nother section on it.
I did not know that.
Now that there didn't used to be then. So we slackers, slid through on that easy route to college education. Listen, good intentions often make for terrible legislation. I mean, the letter of the law is on paper, but the spirit of the law is written in the hearts of men. With affirmative action, Lady Justice is effectively peeking from underneath the blindfold to determine the color and sex of a person instead of just dispassionately deciding on the basis of performance alone. As a result, legislation intended to hamstring white men by some people now works to their advantage in some cases, and the intended beneficiaries actually face a tougher standard. As my Pennsylvania Dutch ancestors might say, it wonders me. It wonders me that universities run almost exclusively by left-wing academics for decades need a federal law to tell them to admit more minorities. Isn't that already the desire of their hearts? And keep in mind, the studies I mentioned were conducted among the elite universities, not among the Humpties in the hinterland at the state schools. It wonders me that diversity is valued above merit, even if enhancing the former means diminishing the latter. A Harvard or Yale degree used to mean something. It used to place you among the ranks of the best and brightest. And now, thanks to affirmative action, your Ivy League degree means that you're among the best in your race and sex cohort proportionate to its representation in the general population. As Bill suggested, takes a little something away from it, doesn't it? And not only does this kind of government-mandated discrimination, and that's what affirmative action is, actually lead to unintended consequences, but it also calls into question the merits and accomplishments of students whose admission chances were enhanced by factors like skin color and genitalia. These patterns continue to work as you go on, as Steve suggested, in large corporations that seek diversity for its own sake, or as a form of virtue-signaling self-flagellation. Well, all this well-intentioned behavior diminishes the status of those it was meant to help. You know, human dignity arises from competence and accomplishment because those are within the scope of the human will. Life does not reward you for the hand you were dealt, but rather for how you play that hand. For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the entire Right Angle team, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.